In April 2003, just weeks before American forces invaded Iraq, German archaeologists made a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about ancient history. Beneath the dried bed of the Euphrates River, exactly where a 4,000-year-old Sumerian poem said it would be, they found what appeared to be the tomb of King Gilgamesh, the legendary ruler described as 2/3 god and 1/3 man. But what they reportedly found inside defied all explanation. The body wasn't decayed. It wasn't mummified. According to whispered accounts that have circulated for 2 decades, Gilgamesh's body was found in a state that modern science cannot explain. A state of perfect biological suspension. Tonight, we examine the evidence and what it might mean. Close your eyes if you wish, and imagine a land where the sky stretches endless and pale above a terrain so flat that the horizon seems to curve with the very shape of the earth itself. A place where the sun beats down upon cracked mud and scattered ruins, where the wind carries dust that once formed the bricks of temples and palaces, where silence now reigns over what was once the loudest and most vibrant corner of the ancient world. This is southern Iraq as it exists today, a seemingly barren expanse that gives no immediate hint of the wonders buried beneath its surface. Yet if you could peel back the layers of sand and time, if you could see through the accumulated centuries the way water sees through stone, you would discover something extraordinary. Something that changes everything. We think we know about who we are and where we came from. For beneath this quiet desolation lie the remains of humanity's first cities, the earliest experiments in civilization, the very places where our ancestors first learned to write their thoughts into permanence, first gazed at the stars and charted their movements, first codified laws and built monuments that scraped against the heavens. And among all these buried wonders, one story stands above the rest. One name echoes across 5,000 years of human memory. One king whose tale became the first great work of literature ever committed to writing. And that name is Gilgamesh. The roots of his epic extend back to the earliest literary traditions at the end of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. A time so distant that the Great Pyramids of Egypt were still new. A time when the world was younger and stranger and more full of mystery than we can easily imagine. And threading through this landscape like a silver ribbon, like a vein carrying the lifeblood of civilization itself, flows the Euphrates River, that ancient waterway that gave drink to the first cities and carried the first boats laden with trade goods. That same river that would one day, according to texts written in clay, serve as the final resting place of the greatest king the world had ever known. The Euphrates has always been more than a river to the people who lived along its banks. It was a boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. It was the source of life in a land where rain was scarce and the sun was merciless. It was sacred and practical and mysterious all at once. And tonight, as we begin this journey together, we do so not to prove anything or to disprove anything, but simply to wonder, to let ourselves be carried along by the current of an ancient story, to feel the same awe that people felt 5,000 years ago when they first heard the tales of the mighty king who sought to live forever. So let us begin, not with arguments or evidence, but with imagination, with the willingness to let our minds drift back across the millennia to a time before our time, to a place that still exists beneath the dust, if only we know how to look for it. The civilization we call Sumer arose in the southern portion of what is now Iraq, sometime around 5,000 years ago. And when we say it arose, we must understand that nothing quite like it had ever existed before. These were not simply villages that grew larger or tribes that settled down. This was something genuinely new under the sun, a complete reimagining of how human beings could live together and what they could accomplish when they pooled their knowledge and their labor. The city of Uruk, where Gilgamesh would one day reign, stood at the heart of this revolution, and at its peak, it may have housed as many as 80,000 people within and around its famous walls. Try to imagine what that meant in a world where most humans still lived in small, scattered communities. Try to imagine the noise and the energy and the sheer overwhelming density of life. Merchants calling out their wares in the marketplaces. Priests chanting in the temples that rose like artificial mountains above the flat landscape. Scribes bent over tablets of wet clay, pressing their reed styluses into the surface to create the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. Craftsmen working bronze and gold and lapis lazuli into objects of startling beauty. Farmers bringing their grain and their livestock to trade for things they could not make themselves. And above it all, the great ziggurat dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, a stepped pyramid of mud brick that proclaimed to all who saw it that this was a place blessed by the gods themselves. This was Uruk. This was where civilization as we know it was being invented day by day, and the people who lived there knew they were part of something special. They called their city the place where the sun rises. They believed it was the first city ever built, the template from which all other cities would be copied, and in many ways they were right. The Sumerians gave us writing itself, that magical technology that allows the thoughts of the dead to speak to the living. Before cuneiform, all human knowledge had to be passed from mouth to ear, from generation to generation. And when the chain broke, the knowledge was lost forever. But writing changed everything. Suddenly, a priest could record a ritual and know that priests 1,000 years hence would perform it exactly the same way. Suddenly, a king could issue a law and know that it would be enforced in distant provinces he would never visit. Suddenly, a poet could compose a story and know that people not yet born would hear it exactly as he intended. The text of the Epic of Gilgamesh was inscribed on these cuneiform clay tablets, pressed into wet earth and then baked hard in kilns or dried in the sun. And some of those tablets survived the rise and fall of empires, survived conquest and fire and flood, survived the forgetting of the very language in which they were written, survived until curious scholars in our own era learned to read them again and discovered treasures beyond imagining. But for centuries after the last cuneiform scribes laid down their styluses, the literature of ancient Mesopotamia was utterly lost. No one could read the strange wedge-shaped marks. No one knew that beneath the mounds dotting the Iraqi landscape lay libraries full of stories and poems and scientific treatises and letters. The silence was complete. And then, in the 19th century, that silence began to break. Archaeologists and linguists pieced together the forgotten script, and slowly the voices of the ancient Sumerians began to speak again. And what voices they were! The Sumerians also mapped the heavens with remarkable precision. They tracked the movements of the planets and predicted eclipses. They divided the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes. Conventions we still use today, Every time we look at a clock or a compass, they developed mathematics sophisticated enough to calculate the areas of irregular fields and the volumes of granaries. They wrote down laws that specified punishments for crimes and protections for the vulnerable. And they told stories, marvelous stories of gods and heroes and monsters, of love and loss, and the search for meaning in a world where death comes for everyone in the end. And the greatest of all these stories was the tale of Gilgamesh. But before we hear his story, we must try to picture the world in which it was first told. Imagine yourself in Uruk, around 2700 before the Common Era. The morning begins before dawn, when the air is still cool and the stars are fading in the east. You wake on a reed mat spread over a mud brick platform. The walls of your house are thick to keep out the brutal heat of the afternoon. There are no windows, only small vents near the ceiling to let the air circulate. You eat a simple breakfast of barley porridge, sweetened perhaps with dates. You drink beer that your household has brewed from fermented grain. Outside, the streets are already beginning to fill with people. Donkeys laden with goods, dogs scavenging in the gutters, children running errands for their parents. The smell of bread baking in communal ovens mingles with less pleasant odors from the tanneries and the dye works. If you are a farmer, you head out to the fields where irrigation channels bring the precious water of the Euphrates to your crops of barley and wheat and vegetables. If you are a craftsman, you go to your workshop and resume the work you left yesterday. If you are a scribe, you make your way to the temple complex where you will spend the day copying texts or recording transactions or taking dictation from officials. And over everything looms the great ziggurat, that stepped mountain of brick that connects earth to heaven, where the priests perform their rituals and the goddess Inanna is believed to descend on certain holy days to bless her people. This is your world. This is all you have ever known. And yet you are aware that your world is part of something larger, something that stretches back into a past so deep it fades into legend. The Sumerians maintained what we call the Sumerian King List, a remarkable document that claims to record every ruler who ever held power in the land, going back to a time before the Great Flood, a time when kings ruled for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. The list moves from the mythical to the historical without any clear boundary. From kings who reigned for impossible centuries to kings whose reigns can be confirmed by other records. And somewhere in that transition zone between pure myth and documented history stands the name of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, who, according to the list, ruled for 126 years. Most historians today generally agree that Gilgamesh was a real person, a historical king of the Sumerian city-state of Uruk, who probably ruled sometime during the early part of what scholars call the early dynastic period. The exact dates cannot be determined with certainty, but the scholar Stephanie Daly notes that they are generally agreed to lie between 2800 and 2500 before the Common Era, which means that if Gilgamesh lived, he did so roughly 1,000 years before Moses and 1,500 years before the Trojan War, at a time when Stonehenge was still being built and the first great civilizations of the Indus Valley were just beginning to flourish. We have evidence that Gilgamesh was remembered as a real ruler even in his own time. And shortly thereafter, inscriptions credit him with building the mighty walls of Uruk, those famous fortifications that later generations would marvel at and attribute to superhuman effort. A According to the epic, the walls stretched for 6 miles and were wide enough for a chariot to drive along their top. Whether the historical Gilgamesh actually built them, or whether the walls were simply attributed to him by later tradition because he was the most famous king associated with the city, we cannot say. But the walls themselves were real. Archaeologists have traced their foundations, and in the ancient world, walls of that magnitude were a wonder worth singing about. Yet, Gilgamesh was never simply a historical figure in the way we might think of later kings whose deeds are recorded in straightforward chronicles. From the very beginning, he inhabited that strange territory between history and mythology. Where the greatest heroes dwell, the epic tells us that Gilgamesh was named from birth for fame, that he was marked from the start as someone whose story would be remembered. And most remarkably, the texts declare that he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, a minor deity associated with wisdom and the interpretation of dreams. His father was a mortal man. Some accounts say a priest, others a king. But whatever his father's status, the result was a being of extraordinary nature. More than human, but not quite fully divine, blessed with superhuman strength and beauty and intelligence, but still subject to the one fate that gods escape, the fate of death. His very name seems to encode this dual nature. Scholars interpret it to mean something like, the ancestor is a young man, from the Sumerian words for ancestor or elder, combined with the word for young man, as if his name itself proclaimed that he was both ancient and new, both connected to the mythical past and planted firmly in the present. During his lifetime, if the traditions can be trusted, Gilgamesh was a powerful and sometimes tyrannical ruler who drove his people hard, but also protected them from external threats and raised their city to new heights of glory. But after his death, something remarkable happened. And during the later early dynastic period, Gilgamesh was worshipped as a god at various locations across Sumer. Temples were dedicated to him, offerings were made in his name. He had become not just a remembered king, but a divine figure, a judge of the dead in the underworld according to some texts, a hero whose spirit continued to influence the world of the living. This transformation from mortal king to immortal god is one of the great themes of his story. For the epic that bears his name is above all concerned with the question of whether death can be escaped and what remains of us when our bodies fail. And this brings us to the mystery at the heart of our tale tonight. For if Gilgamesh was merely a king who died and was mourned and buried and eventually forgotten, except as a character in old stories, then his tomb would be simply an archaeological curiosity, interesting, but not extraordinary. But the ancient texts tell us something strange about what happened to Gilgamesh when he died, something that would remain buried in scholarly obscurity for millennia until a team of German archaeologists stumbled upon evidence that the old stories might be more than just stories, something that hints at possibilities. We are still struggling to understand and to know what those texts say. We must first hear the tale they tell, the epic of the king who sought eternal life and what he found instead. But that is a story for the next part of our journey together. So let us pause here for a moment. Let us breathe. Let us let the images of ancient Uruk settle in our minds, like sediment settling in still water. The mud brick houses, the towering ziggurat, the markets and temples and workshops, the walls that a demigod king supposedly built. the river that gave life to it all, and somewhere beneath that river. According to texts, we are only beginning to understand the final resting place of a king whose story would outlast his kingdom by thousands of years. A king who wanted to live forever and who, in some strange way, may have gotten his wish. Long before Homer sang of Troy, long before the pyramids rose from the Egyptian sands, long before the great civilizations of Greece and Rome were even a whisper in the dreams of history, there existed a story so old that it makes our most ancient texts seem young by comparison. And this story, pressed into clay tablets by hands that turned to dust 4,000 years ago, tells of a king named Gilgamesh and his desperate quest to live forever. And it is, as far as we know, the oldest great work of literature ever created by human hands. The very first epic, the original hero's journey from which all others would eventually flow like tributaries, feeding into an endless river of storytelling that continues to this day. The literary history of Gilgamesh stretches back to at least 5 Sumerian poems about the legendary king of Uruk, some of which scholars believe may date back to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, making them over 4,000 years old, older than the Bible, older than the Iliad, older than virtually every text you have ever read or heard of. And yet, despite this incredible age, the story feels strangely familiar because it deals with themes that have never stopped haunting humanity since we first gained the capacity to contemplate our own mortality. The version most people encounter today, what scholars call the Standard Babylonian version, was compiled by a priest and scholar named Sinleki Unini, sometime between 1300 and 1000 BCE. And this ancient editor gathered earlier fragments and oral traditions and wove them into a coherent narrative of 12 tablets, each one a chapter in the life of a king who was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, a being caught perpetually between the realm of the gods and the world of men, blessed with supernatural strength and wisdom, yet cursed to die like any common laborer in the fields. Picture, if you will, the city of Uruk in its glory days. Now its massive walls stretching for miles around a metropolis that held perhaps 50,000 souls, making it one of the largest cities on Earth at that time. And within those legendary walls that Gilgamesh himself was said to have built, the young king ruled with an iron fist that bordered on tyranny. For the epic tells us he was restless and wild in his youth, taking whatever he wanted, bedding any woman who caught his eye, exhausting his subjects with endless construction projects and military campaigns, until the people of Uruk cried out to the gods for relief from their superhuman king. The gods heard these prayers, and their answer was not to destroy Gilgamesh, but to create for him a companion, an equal, someone who could match his strength and temper his wildness. And so they fashioned Enkidu from clay and water and the wild essence of the untamed steppe, a man who was not born of woman, but sculpted by divine hands, who lived among the animals and knew nothing of civilization, until a temple priestess was sent to tame him with 7 days and 7 nights of lovemaking that separated him forever from the beasts and drew him inexorably toward the great city where his fated brother awaited. The meeting of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is one of the great scenes in world literature. 2 titans colliding in the streets of Uruk, wrestling through doorways and alleys, shaking the very foundations of buildings with the force of their combat, until finally they recognize in each other something they had never found before, and their battle transforms into an embrace, and their rivalry becomes the deepest friendship the ancient world had ever recorded, a bond that would define both their lives and, ultimately, their deaths. Together, these two heroes set out on adventures that pushed the boundaries of the known world, and their first great quest took them to the cedar forest, a place of primordial darkness and terror, located somewhere in the mountains of what is now Lebanon, or perhaps Syria, where a fearsome giant named Humbaba had been appointed by the gods to guard the sacred trees. The journey itself took many weeks, and the epic describes their passage through mountain ranges and across vast distances. Camping each night to perform rituals and interpret dreams that foretold both triumph and tragedy. And when they finally reached the forest, they found it to be a place of supernatural beauty and dread. The cedars so tall and ancient that their tops seemed to brush against the belly of heaven itself. In the old Babylonian version of this tale, there is a curious passage that has fascinated scholars and alternative historians alike, for it states that Gilgamesh and Enkidu penetrated into the forest and opened the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki, those mysterious divine beings who figure so prominently in Sumerian mythology. And while mainstream scholars interpret this as simply reaching a sacred grove, others have wondered if something more profound was being described, some hidden sanctuary or repository of ancient knowledge that the heroes discovered in their quest. The battle with Humbaba was fierce and terrible, the giant pleading for his life and offering to serve Gilgamesh, to give him all the cedars of the forest. But Enkidu urged his friend to show no mercy, and together they cut down the guardian and took his head as a trophy, an act of hubris that would not go unpunished by the gods who had appointed Humbaba to his eternal watch. They returned to Uruk as conquering heroes, laden with cedar wood that would be used to build great doors for the temple of Enlil. But their triumph was short-lived, for they had attracted the attention of more powerful beings, most dangerously the goddess Ishtar, the queen of heaven herself, who looked upon the handsome Gilgamesh fresh from his victory and desired him for her own. When Gilgamesh rejected her advances, listing all the previous lovers she had destroyed or transformed into animals, Ishtar flew into a rage that shook the heavens and demanded that her father Anu release the bull of heaven to destroy Uruk and punish the arrogant king who had spurned her. The bull of heaven descended upon the city like a natural disaster, its snorting breath opening up great pits in the earth that swallowed hundreds of men, its hooves shaking the ground with earthquakes. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu were equal to even this divine beast, and together they wrestled it to the ground, Enkidu seizing it by the tail and horns, while Gilgamesh drove his sword between its shoulders, killing the creature and adding another trophy to their growing legend. But the gods had seen enough of these mortal heroes defying the divine order, killing sacred guardians and slaying heavenly bulls, and in their council they decreed that one of the two friends must die as punishment, and because Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine and thus partially protected, the sentence fell upon Enkidu, the wild man made from clay, the created being who had become more human than many born of woman. The death of Enkidu is perhaps the most emotionally devastating sequence in ancient literature, drawn out over many days as the once mighty warrior weakens from a mysterious illness sent by the gods, plagued by dreams of the underworld where he sees the fate that awaits all mortals. a house of dust, where kings and priests and common men all sit together in darkness, wearing feathers like birds, eating clay and drinking muddy water for eternity. Gilgamesh watched his friend waste away and could do nothing to stop it. This king, who had defeated monsters and giants and the bull of heaven itself, was powerless against the simple reality of death. And when Enkidu finally breathed his last, Gilgamesh refused to accept it, sitting beside the body for 7 days and 7 nights, refusing to allow burial, refusing to believe his brother was truly gone. In one of the most haunting lines in all of ancient literature, the epic tells us that Gilgamesh clung to Enkidu's body and denied that he had died until a maggot dropped from the nose of the corpse. And only then, confronted with this undeniable sign of decay, did the king finally release his friend to the earth and begin the period of grief that would transform him from a hero into something else entirely. A seeker, a pilgrim, a man utterly broken by the discovery of his own mortality. For if Enkidu could die, then so could Gilgamesh. And this revelation struck the king like a physical blow, sending him fleeing from his city, from his throne, from everything he had known, wandering into the wilderness dressed in animal skins, his hair matted and wild, his body gaunt from forgetting to eat, consumed entirely by a terror of death that nothing could ease. The quest for immortality that follows is the heart of the epic, the journey that has resonated across millennia because it speaks to the deepest fear that lives within every human heart. The knowledge that no matter what we achieve, no matter how strong or wise or beloved we become, we will all one day cease to exist. And Gilgamesh, for all his divine blood and supernatural gifts, wanted desperately to escape this fate. He traveled to the ends of the earth, to the twin mountains called Mashu, where the sun rises and sets, guarded by scorpion beings with faces that brought death to any who looked upon them. And even these terrible guardians were moved by the grief they saw in the king's eyes and allowed him to pass through the mountain into a darkness so complete that he could not see his hand before his face. For 12 double hours, he walked through this absolute darkness, feeling his way forward, refusing to turn back. And when he finally emerged, he found himself in a garden of the gods, where the trees bore jewels instead of fruit, where carnelian and lapis lazuli hung from branches like apples. And at the edge of this paradise sat a tavern keeper named Siduri, who would give him directions to the one being who might hold the secret he sought. Across the waters of death, in a place no mortal had ever visited and returned from, lived Utnapishtim and his wife, the only humans ever granted immortality by the gods, survivors of the great flood that had wiped out humanity generations before. And it was to this ancient sage that Gilgamesh directed his steps, convincing the ferryman Urshanabi to take him across waters that would dissolve the flesh of any mortal who touched them. When Gilgamesh finally stood before Utnapishtim, he must have been a frightening sight, this once proud king reduced to a wild-eyed wanderer, his body scratched and torn, his clothes rotted away, and he poured out his grief and his fear and his desperate hope that somehow he too might escape the fate that had claimed his friend. But Utnapishtim had hard truths to deliver, explaining that his own immortality was a unique gift given in unique circumstances that could never be repeated. For the gods had grown tired of humanity and sent the flood to destroy them. But the god Ea had secretly warned Utnapishtim to build a great boat and save his family and the animals. And after the waters receded, the gods relented and granted him eternal life as compensation for his faithful service. But they swore never to grant such a gift again. In the standard Akkadian version of the epic, Utnapishtim describes the Anunnaki in a passage that has generated much speculation, referring to them as 7 judges of the underworld who preside over the fates of the dead, and this image of the Anunnaki as chthonic deities, beings associated with the realm beneath the earth, adds another layer to the mystery of who or what these entities truly were in Sumerian cosmology. Still, Gilgamesh would not accept defeat, and so Utnapishtim offered him a test, simply to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. For if he could not conquer sleep, how could he hope to conquer death? And of course, Gilgamesh failed immediately, his exhausted body betraying him. And he slept for 7 days, while Utnapishtim's wife baked a loaf of bread each day to prove how long he had been unconscious. Dejected and finally accepting his mortality, Gilgamesh prepared to return home. But the wife of Utnapishtim took pity on him and convinced her husband to offer one final gift: the secret of a plant that grew at the bottom of the sea, a thorny thing called Old Man Becomes Young, that could restore youth though not grant true immortality. Gilgamesh dove deep into the waters, tied stones to his feet to sink faster, and found the plant growing in the abyss. And though it cut his hands with its thorns, he grasped it tightly and rose triumphant to the surface, filled with new hope that he could at least extend his life, perhaps share this gift with the elders of Uruk, perhaps even one day find true immortality through further quests. But fate had one more cruel lesson to teach the king of Uruk, for as he travelled home, he stopped to bathe in a cool pool, and while he was in the water, a serpent rose up silently from the depths, and it carried off the plant, and as it took it away, it shed its scaly skin, slithering off renewed and rejuvenated, while Gilgamesh could only watch in despair. And thereupon, Gilgamesh sat down and wept, his tears flowing over his cheeks, and he cried out to the ferryman, asking for whom had his arms grown weary, for whom had his heart pumped blood. He had found nothing for himself. He had laboured only to give the gift of youth to a snake, and all his suffering had been for nothing. The conventional reading of the epic ends with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, a changed man, no longer the tyrant of his youth, but a wise king who had learned to accept his mortality, finding consolation in the great walls he had built, the civilization he had created, the legacy he would leave behind. For this is the immortality available to mortals, not the continuation of the body, but the persistence of memory, of works, of stories told around fires for thousands of years. But there is another text, older and more mysterious than the standard Babylonian version, that tells a different ending to the story of the great king. And it is this text, largely overlooked by popular retellings, that holds the key to understanding what may have actually happened to the body of Gilgamesh when his long life finally came to an end. The Death of Gilgamesh is a Sumerian poem that scholars date to before the Ur-3 period, meaning it was composed sometime before 2047 BCE, making it potentially older than the epic itself, a fragment of tradition that preserved details lost or suppressed in later versions. And what it describes is remarkable in its specificity and strange in its implications. The poem tells us that when Gilgamesh finally died, and even the 2/3 divine king could not escape death forever, the people of Uruk did not simply bury their king in a tomb or cremate his body, as was common in ancient Mesopotamia. Instead, they undertook an engineering project of almost unbelievable ambition and secrecy, a burial that was designed to hide the king's body from all who might seek it until the end of time itself. Fragments of this text were found at the ancient site of Mituran, known today as Tel Haddad, and they relate that upon his death, Gilgamesh was buried under the riverbed itself. And, to accomplish this feat, the workmen of Uruk temporarily diverted the flow of the Euphrates, one of the mightiest rivers in the ancient world, channeling its waters into side channels while they worked in the exposed riverbed below. The text is specific in its timeline, stating that not even the first month had passed. It was not 5 or 10 days before they had opened up the Euphrates and diverted its high water, and the sun god Utu himself looked down at the exposed riverbed with admiration as the workers labored to construct something extraordinary in the mud and stone below. Then, as soon as the water in the bed of the Euphrates had receded, the poem tells us, his tomb was built there from stone, not a simple grave, but a massive stone structure erected in the temporary absence of the river. A tomb built with the knowledge that once the waters returned, it would be hidden forever beneath the flowing currents. And this is the detail that transforms the Death of Gilgamesh from a mere funerary poem into something far more mysterious. For when the bed of the river was dry, they built a large stone tomb and buried Gilgamesh inside of it before allowing the water to return once more and flood over his final resting place, sealing him beneath the waters of the Euphrates for eternity, in a tomb that no grave robber could reach, that no enemy could desecrate, that would remain hidden and inviolate for as long as the river continued to flow. Think about this for a moment. Think about the engineering required, the labor force, the planning, the precise calculations needed to divert one of the great rivers of the ancient world. All to hide a single body in a tomb that no one would ever be able to find or enter. And ask yourself why such extraordinary measures would be taken for any king, even one believed to be 2/3 divine, unless there was something about that body that required such elaborate concealment. For thousands of years, this text was considered simply mythology, a poetic fancy, an exaggeration of royal funerary practices designed to glorify the legendary king. And scholars who studied it assumed that, like so much of the Gilgamesh tradition, it was symbolic rather than literal, a way of saying the king was given an honorable burial befitting his status, rather than an actual description of engineering events that took place. But in the spring of 2003, as a German archaeological team worked at the site of ancient Uruk with sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry equipment, they discovered something beneath the former course of the Euphrates River that changed everything. A structure exactly where the ancient poem said it would be, in the precise location described in a text written over 4,000 years ago. And what they found there would launch a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. In the spring of 2003, as the world held its breath watching tensions escalate in the Middle East, something remarkable was quietly unfolding beneath the ancient sands of southern Iraq. Something that would soon capture the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and seekers of forbidden knowledge alike. A team of German archaeologists led by Jörg Fassbinder, a respected geophysicist from the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments in Munich, had been conducting extensive surveys in the region surrounding the ancient city of Uruk. using cutting-edge magnetometry technology that could peer beneath the earth without disturbing a single grain of sand. What they discovered would make headlines around the world, albeit briefly, before being swallowed by the chaos of war. On the 29th of April 2003, the BBC News ran an article with a headline that seemed to belong more to the realm of fantasy than serious journalism. Gilgamesh tomb believed found, it declared, and for those who understood the significance of those words, the implications were staggering. For here was not merely a claim of discovering some minor royal burial or forgotten noble's resting place. This was the potential discovery of the tomb of Gilgamesh himself, the legendary king who had ruled Uruk nearly 5,000 years ago, the hero of humanity's oldest written story, the man who was said to be two-thirds divine and who had journeyed to the ends of the earth in search of immortality. The magnetometry surveys had revealed something extraordinary beneath the desert floor, an entire ancient city preserved in remarkable detail, its streets and temples and homes all visible in the magnetic data, like a ghost photograph of a world that had vanished millennia ago. The team mapped gardens that had once bloomed with date palms and fruit trees, fields where ancient farmers had grown barley and wheat, homes where families had lived and loved and died, and an intricate system of canals that had earned Uruk the nickname Venice of the Desert in its heyday. But it was what they found just outside the city walls that truly captured their attention and set their hearts racing with a mixture of scientific excitement and something approaching awe. There, in an area that had once been the middle of the Euphrates River itself, the magnetometry revealed the unmistakable outlines of a substantial structure, a building that appeared to be exactly where the ancient Sumerian texts said it would be. Fassbinder, cautious as any good scientist must be, chose his words carefully when speaking to reporters. "I do not want to say definitely it was the grave of King Gilgamesh," he told them, "but it looks very similar to that described in the epic. We found, just outside the city, an area in the middle of the former Euphrates River, the remains of such a building which could be interpreted as a burial." Consider for a moment the weight of those words. For thousands of years, the Death of Gilgamesh poem had described how the people of Uruk had diverted the mighty Euphrates, built a tomb of stone in the exposed riverbed, laid their beloved king to rest within it, and then allowed the waters to flow back over his final resting place, hiding it forever from the eyes of men and the ravages of time. Scholars had long assumed this was simply poetic fancy, a mythological flourish added to enhance the legendary status of a figure who may or may not have actually existed. But here, using technology that would have seemed like magic to the ancient Sumerians themselves, a team of modern scientists had found what appeared to be exactly what the texts described, exactly where they said it would be. The location matched, the positioning matched, the orientation matched. A structure that could be interpreted as a burial sitting in what was once the middle of the Euphrates River, just outside the walls of ancient Uruk. Either this was the most remarkable coincidence in the history of archaeology, or the poets who composed the Death of Gilgamesh nearly 4,000 years ago had been recording actual historical fact, not spinning elaborate mythology. The implications rippled outward like waves in a still pond. If this detail was accurate, what else in the ancient texts might be true? If they had correctly preserved the location of Gilgamesh's tomb for 4 millennia, What other knowledge might be encoded in those weathered clay tablets? But the discovery of the tomb's location, remarkable as it was, would prove to be only the beginning of a far stranger story, one that ventures into territory where verified archaeology gives way to whispered rumors and extraordinary claims that remain, to this day, neither confirmed nor definitively debunked. In the weeks and months that followed the initial discovery, reports began to circulate, first among the archaeological community, then spreading to alternative history circles and conspiracy forums across the nascent internet. These reports spoke of something found within the tomb itself, something that defied conventional explanation and challenged everything modern science believed about the limits of preservation and the nature of death itself. According to these accounts, and it must be stressed that these remain accounts and claims rather than verified scientific findings, the German team and others who gained access to the site discovered that the tomb was not empty. Gilgamesh, or whoever lay within that ancient structure, was still there. But more remarkably, more impossibly, the body was said to be in a condition that simply should not have been possible after nearly 5,000 years. The whispers spoke of a state of preservation that went beyond anything known to science, beyond even the most perfectly preserved Egyptian mummies or the bog bodies of northern Europe. They spoke of a body that appeared not merely preserved, but somehow suspended, as if death itself had been placed on pause rather than allowed to run its natural course. Was his body preserved through natural means, some asked, or was some unknown technology at play? If his biological functions were somehow suspended rather than deteriorated, could modern science explain it? Or would the explanation require looking to something beyond current understanding? These questions hung in the air, tantalizing and troubling in equal measure. Skeptics pointed out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that rumors circulating on the internet hardly constituted scientific proof of anything. Believers countered that the very fact of the tomb's discovery, exactly where ancient texts said it would be, should give pause to those who dismissed the other claims out of hand. Perhaps, they suggested, there was more to the ancient stories than modern rationalism was prepared to accept. Perhaps the Sumerians knew things we have forgotten, possessed knowledge or technology that we in our arrogance assume could not have existed in such a distant era. The truth, whatever it may be, remains elusive, for events were about to overtake the archaeological expedition in a way that would ensure the mysteries of Gilgamesh's tomb remained unsolved, perhaps for generations to come. Just weeks after the BBC reported the discovery of what might be Gilgamesh's final resting place, the world changed forever. On March 20th, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom commenced, and hundreds of thousands of coalition troops poured across the Iraqi border. The German archaeological team, along with researchers from numerous other countries, were forced to abandon their work and flee the country as bombs began to fall and the ancient land of Sumer was transformed once again into a battlefield. The timing struck many observers as curious, to say the least. Here was perhaps the most significant archaeological discovery of the modern era, a find that could rewrite our understanding of ancient history and the origins of human civilization. And it was almost immediately buried, not in sand, but in the chaos of war and the fog of geopolitics. Within days of the invasion beginning, the story of Gilgamesh's tomb had vanished from global news coverage, replaced by images of shock and awe, of statues toppling and soldiers advancing through the desert. Some saw nothing more than unfortunate coincidence in this timing, and the cruel irony of history that one of humanity's oldest stories should be interrupted by one of its newest conflicts. Others, however, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why had the story disappeared so quickly from the news? Why had there been no follow-up reporting, no scientific papers, no official statements from the German archaeological authorities or the Iraqi Ministry of Antiquities? And what had happened to the site itself in the months and years that followed the invasion? Stranger still were the accounts that began to surface from witnesses who claimed to have seen unusual activity around the tomb site in the aftermath of the invasion. According to these reports, which again must be classified as unverified claims rather than established facts, United States military personnel were observed conducting excavations in the area, operations that had nothing to do with the official military objectives of the campaign. What were they looking for? What, if anything, did they find? And where did it go? These questions have never been officially answered, and those who ask them are often dismissed as conspiracy theorists grasping at shadows. Yet the questions persist, fueled in part by the undeniable fact that something very real was lost during those chaotic days of April 2003. The Baghdad Museum, one of the world's great repositories of ancient Mesopotamian artifacts, was left unguarded during the invasion, and in the lawless days that followed, looters descended upon it like locusts. Tens of thousands of artifacts vanished. Are some of them among the oldest and most significant objects ever created by human hands? Cuneiform tablets that had survived for 4,000 years disappeared into the black market. Statues of gods and kings that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires were carried off into the night. The loss was incalculable, a wound to human heritage that may never fully heal. Some of those artifacts have since been recovered, returned through painstaking international efforts to track down stolen antiquities. But many remain missing, scattered across private collections around the world, their locations known only to those who possess them and have no intention of giving them up. And if the rumors about the tomb of Gilgamesh are true, if something truly remarkable was found beneath the dry bed of the Euphrates in those final days before the war, then it too has vanished into the same fog of uncertainty that shrouds so much of what happened in Iraq during those tumultuous years. The site itself remains difficult to access, the region unstable, the political situation complicated. No major archaeological expedition has been able to return and conduct the kind of thorough, systematic excavation that would be necessary to confirm or refute the claims that swirl around the discovery. And so, we are left with questions rather than answers, with whispers rather than proof, with a mystery that may be one of the most profound in the history of human civilization. Or maybe nothing more than a combination of coincidence, wishful thinking, and the human tendency to find patterns and meaning where none exist. What we know for certain is this: a German archaeological team did discover something in the desert outside ancient Uruk, something that matched the descriptions in texts written nearly 4,000 years ago. They did find evidence of a structure in what was once the middle of the Euphrates River, exactly where the Death of Gilgamesh said the legendary king was buried. And then the war came, and the scientists were forced to leave, and the world moved on to other concerns, leaving the secrets of the tomb to slumber once more beneath the ancient sands. Whether Gilgamesh himself still lies there, and in what condition, remains one of the great unanswered questions of modern archaeology. Perhaps someday, when peace returns to that troubled land and the tools of science can once again be brought to bear on its buried secrets, we will finally learn the truth. Or perhaps we will discover that the ancient poets were simply poets after all, embroidering their tales with impossible details to honor a king who died as all men must, and whose remains long ago returned to the dust from which they came. Or perhaps, just perhaps, we will discover that the ancients knew something we have forgotten, that the tomb of Gilgamesh holds secrets that could transform our understanding of what is possible, of what ancient civilizations were capable of, and of what it truly means to be human in a universe far stranger and more wondrous than our modern certainties allow us to imagine. Until that day comes, the mystery endures, as patient and timeless as the desert itself, waiting for those with the courage and the opportunity to seek the truth. Let us now turn our attention to the most speculative and yet perhaps most fascinating aspect of this entire mystery, the question of stasis itself. For if the reports that emerged from the 2003 expedition contain even a grain of truth, then we are confronted with something that challenges our understanding not only of ancient history, but of biology itself. And we must ask ourselves what it would mean for a body to be found in a state of suspended animation after nearly 5,000 years beneath the waters of the Euphrates. A question that leads us down pathways both scientific and mystical, forcing us to consider possibilities that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to entertain. The concept of stasis, of biological suspension, is not unknown to modern science. For we have observed it in nature, in creatures that can survive being frozen solid, in tardigrades that can endure the vacuum of space, in certain species of frogs that produce natural antifreeze compounds, allowing them to exist in a state between life and death for extended periods. And medical science has made advances in therapeutic hypothermia and cryopreservation that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. Yet what we have achieved is measured in hours or days, not millennia. And so, if Gilgamesh was truly found in a state resembling suspended animation, we must ask whether the ancients possessed knowledge or technology that has been lost to us, or whether some natural phenomenon unique to the conditions of his burial produced an effect that we cannot yet explain. The Sumerians were not primitive people stumbling through the darkness of prehistory, for they developed the first known writing system. They created sophisticated mathematics, including a base 60 numerical system that we still use today when we measure time and angles. They mapped the heavens with remarkable precision and tracked the movements of planets that are invisible to the naked eye. They built monumental architecture and created irrigation systems that transformed the harsh landscape between the rivers into the fertile crescent that would nurture civilization itself. And their medical texts reveal a surprisingly advanced understanding of anatomy and pharmacology. So when we consider whether they might have possessed knowledge beyond what we typically attribute to them, we should perhaps approach the question with more humility than our modern technological pride usually allows. What would preservation mean in the context of an ancient king believed to be two-thirds divine, a being whose very nature was said to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal? And could the rituals described in the Death of Gilgamesh text, the diversion of the great river, the construction of the stone tomb, the elaborate burial of his household, and treasures alongside him. Could these have been more than mere ceremony? Could they have incorporated techniques or substances or processes designed to maintain the king in a state between life and death, awaiting perhaps some future awakening or reunion with the divine beings from whom he claimed descent? These questions cannot be answered with certainty, and we present them not as claims, but as contemplations, as thought experiments that invite us to consider possibilities beyond the boundaries of conventional academic discourse. For the mystery of Gilgamesh has always been the mystery of mortality itself, and if there is even a possibility that ancient wisdom found a way to suspend that final journey into the underworld, it would represent not merely an archaeological discovery, but a fundamental challenge to our understanding of what is possible. The reports from 2003 spoke of a body that defied the expectations of those who found it, though the precise details remain frustratingly vague and unconfirmed, lost in the chaos that engulfed Iraq in the weeks following the discovery. And we are left to wonder whether the German archaeologists truly encountered something inexplicable beneath the dried riverbed, something that might explain why the site attracted such intense interest from forces beyond the academic community, or whether the stories have grown in the telling, as stories about Gilgamesh have always grown, accumulating layers of legend and speculation over the centuries and millennia since he first walked the walls of Uruk. Now we must consider the beings whom the Sumerians credited with the creation of humanity itself and the bestowing of civilization upon our ancestors. The mysterious Anunnaki, whose name echoes through the cuneiform tablets and whose nature has been debated by scholars and speculators alike for more than a century. In the earliest Sumerian writings, the Anunnaki appear as a group of deities within the Mesopotamian pantheon, descended from and the sky god and Kai the earth goddess, powerful beings who inhabited both heaven and earth and who held dominion over natural forces and human destiny. And the texts describe them as majestic and wise, sometimes benevolent and sometimes fearsome, intervening in human affairs according to their own inscrutable purposes, and occasionally taking mortal lovers or choosing human champions to carry out their will. The name itself has been translated in various ways, with some scholars interpreting it as meaning those of royal blood or princely offspring, while others have suggested it means those who from heaven came. And this latter translation has proven particularly influential among those who see in the ancient Sumerian records evidence of something more than mythology. The stories speak of a time before the Great Flood, when the Anunnaki walked openly among humanity, teaching the arts of civilization, instructing humans in writing and mathematics and astronomy and agriculture, establishing kingship as a divine institution, and selecting certain bloodlines to rule over the newly civilized peoples of Mesopotamia. And these accounts describe the gods descending from the heavens in vessels that blazed like fire, dwelling in temples that rose like mountains from the flat plains of Sumer, possessing technologies that seemed to transcend the natural order, and eventually departing or withdrawing from direct contact with humanity, leaving behind the knowledge and the kings and the stories that would echo through all subsequent human history. Gilgamesh himself was said to be the product of a union between a mortal king and the goddess Ninsun, making him 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. a proportion that has puzzled mathematicians and mythologists alike. And this semi-divine nature was credited as the source of his extraordinary strength. His towering stature described in the texts as 11 cubits tall, his supernatural beauty, and his burning desire to transcend the mortality that his human portion condemned him to suffer. In the old Babylonian version of the epic, Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu are said to have penetrated into the forest and opened the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. A tantalizing passage that has been interpreted by some as suggesting that these heroes had access to the hidden places of the gods, perhaps to their technologies or their knowledge. And in the standard Akkadian version, the immortal Utnapishtim describes the Anunnaki as 7 judges of the underworld who would determine the fates of the dead, suggesting that these beings had power over the boundary between life and death itself. The ancient astronaut theory, which has attracted millions of followers around the world despite being rejected by mainstream academia, proposes that the Anunnaki were not deities in the conventional sense, but rather visitors from beyond our world. Are advanced beings from another planet who came to Earth in the distant past, and whose interactions with early humans were recorded in the mythologies of Sumer, and subsequently passed down through the religious traditions of Babylon, Assyria, and the cultures that followed. This theory was popularized in the 20th century by writers such as Erich von Däniken, whose 1968 book Chariots of the Gods proposed that many ancient monuments and religious traditions could be explained as the result of extraterrestrial contact, and Zecharia Sitchin, whose 1976 work The 12th Planet offered a detailed interpretation of Sumerian texts that identified the Anunnaki as beings from a planet called Nibiru, which he claimed orbits our Sun on a highly elliptical path that brings it into the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. According to Sitchin and those who have built upon his work, the Anunnaki came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago in search of gold and other resources. And finding the labor of mining too arduous for their own kind, they genetically engineered humanity by combining their own DNA with that of existing hominids, creating a worker species that would serve their needs. And the gods and demigods of ancient mythology were simply these extraterrestrial beings and their hybrid offspring, possessed of technologies so advanced that they appeared magical to the humans who witnessed them. Mainstream scholars have thoroughly criticized these interpretations, pointing out errors in Sitchin's translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, as noting that he had no formal training in the ancient languages and that his readings of cuneiform often diverge significantly from those of professional Assyriologists. And the astronomical claims about Nibiru have been rejected by scientists who note that such a planet could not maintain a stable orbit as described and would have been detected by modern instruments if it existed. Yet the ancient astronaut theory persists and even thrives, perhaps because it offers answers to questions that conventional archaeology leaves unanswered. Perhaps because it provides a framework for understanding the apparent sophistication of ancient civilizations that seems to exceed what we believe should have been possible with the tools and knowledge available at the time. Or perhaps simply because it speaks to a deep human longing to believe that we are not alone in the cosmos, and that our ancestors may have had contact with intelligences beyond our world. When we consider Gilgamesh in this light, the question of his alleged stasis takes on new dimensions. For if he was indeed part divine in the sense of carrying genetic material from an advanced non-human species? Might his body have possessed properties that allowed for preservation beyond what would be possible for ordinary humans? Or might the beings who contributed to his ancestry have provided technologies or techniques for suspending biological processes that have since been lost to human knowledge? We present these speculations not as conclusions but as possibilities, acknowledging that they venture far beyond what can be demonstrated through conventional evidence, yet recognizing that the mystery of Gilgamesh has always invited such speculation, from the ancient priests who composed hymns to the divine king, to the medieval scholars who wondered at the fragments of forgotten epics, to the modern researchers who continue to unearth new tablets and new questions from the sands of Iraq. The Sumerians themselves attributed many aspects of their civilization to divine instruction, claiming that the arts of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and governance were gifts bestowed by the gods in the time before the flood. And their astronomical knowledge in particular has drawn the attention of those who wonder how a Bronze Age civilization could have known things that were not rediscovered until the invention of the telescope. For the Sumerians catalogued stars invisible to the naked eye. They tracked planetary movements with precision that rivals modern calculations. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, which requires observations spanning thousands of years to detect. And they possessed a cosmological model that some have argued bears suspicious resemblance to our modern understanding of the solar system. In the 1920s, strange rumors circulated about advanced ancient technology in the region of Mesopotamia. Whispered stories about devices or portals or mechanisms that defied understanding. And while such rumors were dismissed by serious researchers as fantasy or fraud, they contributed to an enduring mystique surrounding the ancient sites of Iraq, a sense that the cradle of civilization might harbor secrets beyond what official archaeology was willing to acknowledge, and this mystique has only grown with each new discovery, each newly translated tablet, each fragment of epic poetry that emerges from the earth or from museum storage to reveal another piece of the puzzle. According to some interpretations of Sitchin's work, the Anunnaki were responsible not only for the creation of humanity, but for the construction of the great monuments of the ancient world, the pyramids of Egypt, the platform of Baalbek in Lebanon, the megalithic structures of Peru and Bolivia, you all built using technologies that ancient humans could not have possessed, and that modern engineers struggled to replicate. And while these claims have been thoroughly debunked by archaeologists who have documented the human labor and ingenuity that created these monuments, they continue to circulate and find new believers, testimony to the enduring power of mystery and the human desire to believe in something beyond the ordinary. The question of lost knowledge versus extraterrestrial intervention may ultimately be unanswerable, at least with the evidence currently available, for we cannot prove that ancient civilizations did not possess technologies that have since been forgotten. Nor can we prove that visitors from other worlds never made contact with our ancestors. We can only evaluate the available evidence according to the standards of our current understanding and acknowledge that our understanding is always incomplete, always subject to revision in light of new discoveries. And the history of science is littered with examples of ideas once considered absurd that later proved correct, as well as ideas once considered certain that later proved false. What remains undeniable is that the Sumerians achieved things that continue to astonish us, that their civilization emerged with a suddenness that puzzles historians who expect cultural development to be gradual, that their mythology describes beings of extraordinary power and knowledge who interacted with humanity in ways that shaped the course of history, and that one of their greatest kings, Gilgamesh of Uruk, became the subject of an epic that has survived 4,000 years and continues to resonate with readers who see in his quest for immortality a reflection of their own deepest fears and hopes. Whether one accepts the ancient astronaut theory as a valid interpretation of the evidence or dismisses it as pseudoscientific fantasy, whether one believes that Gilgamesh was truly found in stasis beneath the Euphrates or considers the reports to be exaggerations or fabrications, whether one views the Anunnaki as literal beings from another world or as mythological expressions of natural forces and human psychology, one question remains that transcends all these debates. A question that Gilgamesh himself asked nearly 5 millennia ago and that we continue to ask today. The question of what happens when we die and whether there is any way to transcend the mortality that defines the human condition. And in seeking answers to that question, we find ourselves walking the same path that the legendary king walked, journeying to the edges of the known world, seeking wisdom from those who came before, and ultimately confronting the mystery that lies at the heart of existence itself. And so, we arrive at the silence, that vast and patient quiet that has settled over the land between the rivers for more than 2 decades now, since the German archaeologists packed their equipment and fled before the approaching storm of war, leaving behind questions that may never be answered in our lifetime. The site where Jorg Fassbinder and his team discovered what they believe to be the tomb of Gilgamesh has remained largely inaccessible since 2003, guarded not by ancient curses or supernatural forces, but by the all-too-human realities of conflict, instability, and the slow grinding machinery of international politics that determines who may dig where and when. We do not know what lies beneath the dried bed of the Euphrates today, whether the tomb structure detected by magnetometry still holds whatever secrets it held when the scanners first revealed its presence, whether the waters have shifted again to conceal it further, or erosion has begun to expose what was hidden for 4,000 years. The Iraqi government has had other concerns in the intervening years. Other priorities more pressing than investigating claims about a legendary king, and the international archaeological community has largely moved on to sites more accessible, more fundable, more likely to yield publishable results within the timeframes demanded by academic careers and grant cycles. But the silence around Gilgamesh does not mean the story has ended. For even as one tomb remains sealed, another kind of discovery continues, piece by piece, tablet by fragment, pulled from the earth by farmers and looters, and occasionally by archaeologists working in the more stable regions of what was once Mesopotamia. In 2011, an Iraqi Assyriologist named Farouk al-Rawi was shown a collection of cuneiform tablets by an antiquities dealer in the Kurdish region of Iraq. And among the fragments, he spotted something remarkable, be a large piece of clay bearing wedge-shaped impressions that he recognized immediately as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a section that had been missing from our understanding of the story. And he urged the Suleymaniye Museum to acquire the entire collection so this piece of human heritage might be preserved and studied rather than disappearing into private collections where it would be lost to scholarship forever. This is how the epic continues to reveal itself to us, not through grand excavations or dramatic tomb openings, but through the patient work of scholars who spend their lives learning to read the voices of the dead pressed into clay, and through the strange channels by which artifacts surface from the earth. Sometimes through legitimate archaeology, and sometimes through the shadowy world of antiquities markets that feeds on instability and conflict. The Epic of Gilgamesh asserts the endurance of civilized values in the face of barbarity. And unlike the physical monuments of ancient Mesopotamia, unlike Nimrud, which was bulldozed, unlike Hatra, which was demolished, unlike Palmyra, which was dynamited, the epic cannot be destroyed, because its substance is words and ideas, patterns of meaning that exist now in translations and transcriptions and digital archives scattered across the world, replicated and preserved in ways the original authors could never have imagined. And the story is not yet complete, for more tablets will come to the surface. More fragments will emerge from museum storerooms where they have sat unread for decades. More pieces of the puzzle will click into place, and perhaps someday the full tale of what the Sumerians believed happened to their greatest king will be known to us in its entirety. But perhaps not. And there is a strange peace in accepting that some questions may remain unanswered, that some mysteries may persist beyond our individual lives and even beyond the span of our civilization. For this is what the Epic of Gilgamesh has been teaching us for 4 millennia. That certainty is not the birthright of mortals, that we must learn to find meaning, not in answers but in the asking, not in destinations but in journeys, not in immortality but in the quality of our brief and precious days. The story of Gilgamesh is ultimately a meditation on mortality, on the human struggle to accept that we will end, that everything we build will crumble, that everyone we love will be lost to us. And yet the tale offers a strange comfort in showing us that this struggle is not ours alone, but has been shared by every generation of human beings, stretching back to the very dawn of civilization. That the king of Uruk, who ruled when the pyramids were not yet built, looked up at the same stars we see tonight and felt the same fear and longing that we feel, wondered the same questions about death and meaning and legacy that keep us awake in the small hours of the night. Whether Gilgamesh truly lies in stasis beneath the Euphrates, preserved by technologies we cannot understand, waiting perhaps for some future awakening, or whether his body long ago returned to the dust from which the gods shaped humanity, his bones indistinguishable now from the sediment of the river that was his tomb. We cannot say with certainty, and perhaps it does not matter, for in either case, Gilgamesh achieved the immortality he sought, not through the plant of eternal youth that the serpent stole, not through the secrets of the gods that remained beyond his grasp, but through the simplest and most powerful magic that humans have ever discovered, the magic of story, the magic of words preserved and passed down from one generation to the next, the magic of being remembered. 4,000 years after his death, we speak the name of Gilgamesh. We tell his tales. We wonder about his tomb. We imagine his face and his voice and his grief for Enkidu. And in doing so, we give him a form of life that transcends biology, a presence in human consciousness that has outlasted empires and languages and religions, and that has survived the rise and fall of civilizations that the people of Uruk could never have imagined. And so, beneath the waters that have flowed for millennia, in the land where writing was born and where humanity first pressed reed stylus to wet clay to capture thought in physical form. Perhaps the greatest king of the ancient world still waits, dreaming whatever dreams the suspended dead might dream. Or perhaps he has simply become one with the earth that bore him, his atoms scattered across the same soil that grew humanity's first cities, incorporated now into date palms and barley, and the bodies of children playing in villages along the river, transformed but not destroyed, changed but not ended. Either way, Gilgamesh endures, not in flesh, but in words pressed into clay, in stories shared first around campfires in mud brick houses, and now across glowing screens in cities that stretch toward the sky, in the eternal human wonder at what lies beyond the veil of death and whether anything of us persists when our bodies fail. The Euphrates still flows, though diminished now by dams and drought, and the stars still wheel overhead in the same patterns the Sumerian priests mapped and named. And somewhere in the darkness between the rivers, the silence holds its secrets close, patient and eternal, waiting for whatever comes next. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the mystery settle around you like a warm blanket. Let go of the need for answers and simply rest in the wonder of questions that have outlasted pyramids and outlasted empires and will outlast us all. Dream of ancient cities rising from the marshes, and of walls so magnificent that even gods stopped to admire them. Dream of a king who loved his friend more than his own life, who walked to the edge of the world in search of forever, who learned at last that the only immortality available to mortals is the immortality of memory, of story, of love that persists beyond the grave. Dream of rivers parting to reveal hidden tombs, of clay tablets emerging from the earth bearing messages from the dead, of the unbroken thread that connects your consciousness in this moment to the consciousness of scribes who lived before the invention of the wheel. Dream of Gilgamesh, and in dreaming, give him life for one more night. Add your moment of attention to the 4,000 years of moments that have kept him present in the human world, and know that someday, perhaps, someone will do the same for you. Will speak your name and wonder about your story, and keep some fragment of you alive in the vast river of human memory that flows from the forgotten past toward the unknowable future, never stopping, never still, carrying us all toward whatever sea awaits at the end of time.